Hello and welcome to Part 5 of the Cisco Catalyst Center Plug-and-Play Discovery series. In this demo, we're going to be using DNS instead to discover our Catalyst Center server. And this is a process where if your DHCP server setup does not allow you to create option 43, or if you have some scenario where adding option 43 to your DHCP pool just isn't feasible for you, you can instead fall back to the secondary method, which is resolving a dynamically created DNS hostname. So this can be done in 3 steps. The first step, of course, requires that you still have a DHCP server and provide a DHCP lease to the new device as it's coming on board. However, instead of option 43, this DHCP lease must include at least one DNS server IP address, and the DNS domain name must be advertised as well. In step 2 of this process, the router or switch will perform a lookup of a dynamically generated DNS hostname, which begins with the hostname PNP server dot whatever your domain name is dot whatever the top level domain is, which usually is .com. So an example would be if your domain name was customer.com, the router or switch plug-and-play agent would attempt to resolve the DNS hostname PNP server.customer.com. Now, your DNS server has to have a record for that DNS hostname that matches the IP address of your Catalyst Center server. And finally, in step 3, this is a very important part that requires a little extra configuration. When using this method, the SSL certificate applied to your Catalyst Center server must have a SAN field, or subject alternative name field, that contains this DNS hostname of pnpserver.yourdomain.com or whatever. This is important because when the plug-and-play agent attempts to establish an HTTPS connection to Catalyst Center, it's going to validate that the DNS hostname that it's using for that connection actually exists in the SSL certificate in the SAN field. And if it doesn't, then the connection will fail because the identity cannot be confirmed of the remote device. So our lab topology has stayed fairly much the same, but there are a couple of things that have changed. And part of that is the introduction of a DNS server and certificate authority, which are running on a Windows server in the lab. So we'll use the same switch that we've been using all along, which is the Catalyst 9500 switch down at the bottom of our topology. And once again, we have kept the management gigabit Ethernet 00 interface disabled. So we're going to be using VLAN 5 on our in-band network connected to our upstream Catalyst 9300 switch. So all of those settings will stay the same. The VLAN 5 SVI has remained the same. However, there are some changes to the DHCP server configuration. And number 1 is that we are not using option 43. So I've deleted that from our DHCP configuration on the Catalyst 9300 switch. And instead, I have included a DNS server IP address and an IP domain name of usps.cisco.com. So with this new setup, we have a couple of other requirements now because our connection is going to be reliant on resolving a hostname to an IP address and then making a secure connection to that server. So the plug-and-play agent is going to be using the DNS hostname rather than an IP address to directly connect. When we do that, when we connect to a device over HTTPS using a hostname, one of the things that gets verified is that that hostname that you are using to connect to that server shows up somewhere in the SSL certificate. And typically, if the hostname that you're connecting to is not actually the host name of the device that you are loading the page from, we have to add an entry to a special field in the SSL certificate called the Subject Alternative Names field, or SAN field. So for this instance, I had to generate a certificate for our Catalyst Center server instead of using the certificate that's created out of the box, the self-signed certificate. I had to update the SAN entries with the proper DNS host names and IPs. And I also had to create a DNS record on our DNS server up in the shared network. So we are adding in this DNS Windows server that's also a certificate authority. And again, we're using the same Catalyst Center server in our shared services network. And both of these are on a separate VLAN, so there is routing involved here. So let's talk a little bit more about these certificate requirements. Out of the box, when Catalyst Center is created, it uses an internal certificate authority to create a self-signed SSL certificate. Basically, that means that it's creating its own HTTPS certificate, but it won't be trusted by anybody because it doesn't use any trusted centralized certificate authority. It's just creating its own certificate. And that's usually okay, except when we begin communicating with it by using a DNS hostname instead of a direct IP address. When that happens, as I mentioned, the plug-and-play agent will attempt to connect to PNP server whatever your domain name is whatever your top-level domain name is, which is usually .com. And it's going to attempt to resolve that DNS hostname to an IP so that it can set up an IP connection. But it's still going to use that hostname to validate that it's connecting to the right server. It's part of the SSL certificate verification process. Essentially, it's going to make sure that whatever device you are connecting to that's hosting that certificate actually is who it says it is. So for that reason, first we need to create a DNS record within our domain name. And over on the right, what you'll see is this is in the web browser now that I've created this new certificate and applied it to our Catalyst Center server. I've connected to the Catalyst Center web management interface, and I'm viewing the certificate details. You can see that the common name that we've created, I've made dnac.usps.cisco.com. However, if we go down through the cert fields, we'll see an extension here called Certificate Subject Alternative Name. And in this field, there are, I believe, 3 total DNS names that you can add and 3 IP addresses that might be alternative IPs. So as long as the DNS host name that you are trying to connect to, which is pnpserver.usps.cisco.com in this case, exists in this certificate SAN field, and you can see it's right here, and the IP address that it's connecting to exists in that field, then it's going to trust that connection. So that's the situation that we're in right here with the lab, and a little more complex, but let's go over and take a look at the lab itself. So first we'll bring up our config snippet, and we'll take a look at that configuration. And as you can see, it's very much the same as when we did the onboarding with VLAN 5. However, in this case, in the DHCP pool, I've removed that option 43, and instead I've put in a domain name of usps.cisco.com and DNS server, which happens to be our Windows server, of 172.16.202.110. All right, let's go take a look at Catalyst Center here, and you can see that the switch is already in there because I've had it reset recently. So we'll have to delete the switch from the plug-and-play inventory. But then we can go back over to the switch itself, and we can issue the PNPA service reset command. And we'll type yes to confirm. We'll wait for all of this to finish, and we'll fast forward through the output on the command line here. Okay, at this point, we can see that the onboarding is complete from the command line. We can see that it has successfully connected to the Catalyst Center server on port 443. And at this point, you can see that it's using that host name instead of the IP address that we had from DHCP option 43. And if we take a look over here in our plug-and-play portal, we can see that we did get it reconnected. It's showing the default name of switch again, and our IP address of 172.16.5.26, which is what we got from DHCP from our lease up here. All right, well, that completes our lab here. Thanks for watching.